We're here this afternoon to talk about AI for modern healthcare. We have a lovely panel here today. We have Aldo Faisal from Imperial College London. We have Bari from Kowal from Regeneron, Ian Hickie from the University of Sydney, and Hossein from MIT Media Labs, and also the CEO of Flybits. So we're going to jump right into it today so we don't waste any time. We all know that AI does clever things. We all use it to write things for ourselves or to work on our email, et cetera, but we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about whether or not AI is going to revolutionize healthcare. Is it going to change supply chains? Is it going to change how we care for our elderly parents or our sick children? Is AI going to change what the business model is and how we pay for healthcare, both at the government level and at the individual level? We're going to talk about a lot of different things, including how we use data, how do we work through clinical trials, what kind of policies do we need, especially on things like mental health care. And we're going to talk about how can AI actually be something that gives us some agency and looks at things from a perspective that we can recognize. And so I think I just want to start off right now, when we hear it all the time in the news, AI is going to transform healthcare. What does that even mean? What's the first thing that pops into your mind when you think AI is going to transform healthcare? Do you think surgery, pharma, robotic, nurses? Aldo, jump right in.
So I'll start with what's realistically actually happening right now. We're seeing AI starting to be deployed in hospitals in radiological analysis. So that's stuff we heard about 5 years ago. But what's really going to change the game for a lot of the clinicians out there is AI doing boring operational paperwork, taking a dictation, recording and transcribing stuff, dealing with paperwork. Doctors spend 30% of their time not doing medical care. They fill out forms. And I think that's the practical things we're seeing. We can later talk about what I am seeing, but that's what you're going to see as a patient.
Okay, excellent. Bari, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
So Regeneron's an R&D company, a biopharma, we're looking at, science first, right? And so we're somewhat skeptical on what can AI do in the science space. But to the point that Aldo made, we are starting to really look at how to transform the way we both do research but also enact clinical trials. How do we reach patients? How do we change the time it takes? Today, it takes 10 years from inception and discovery to get a new molecular entity into the market. And so how do we take that down to 2 years, a year? When we had the pandemic, the world pandemic, we were able to do this in months and in sometimes weeks. How do we change the manual effort today to both be able to think through the science in a more proactive way, but also to change the dynamics around how regulatory agencies, individuals, physicians all approach clinical research and bringing new medicines to people who need them.
And Ian, you co-direct the Center for Health and Policy in the Brain and Mind Center. So tell us a little bit about that, because we've been fascinated with the mind and how human beings work for quite a long time.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is most healthcare is not hospital care, and the challenges of the future, economically, socially, are how do you provide care to people in their own homes at low cost that's high quality. So it's not self-care, low quality, it's high quality. So I think the big promise of AI and what we need to deal with is highly personalised care that empowers the consumers of care to get better care, that orientates the system to their needs. And the really big challenges, I think, is where the big innovations will be. They're in child and youth mental health, they're in aged care, they're in systems which cannot cope with the current demand. The supply is low and low quality and not meeting people's needs. Empowered consumers using smart systems and working with healthcare workforces who at the moment are insufficiently trained to support them, so we can make greater use of the community to actually provide effective care, is the future. And that's where AI, I think, has a huge potential promise.
It does have a huge potential, but can I ask you a question there? Like, what's the first thing that we're going to see change in that? Because the community working, the industry, the policy, these are all very kind of large concepts. Like, what's the first thing we're going to see that you think is going to matter?
Well, the principal barrier at the moment sits around regulation of these issues. So we're really fortunate in Australia at the moment to have a really smart health minister who says, just make sure it's safe. Okay, and just make sure it's equitable, and just make sure it doesn't go wrong. So all of those challenges that sit around it and the business models underpin for it, who pays for this massive shift from traditionally high-intensity hospital-based care to these other forms of care is undetermined. And a lot of the things we're determined for, people put more and more money into high intensity, high intervention care, but actually that which will change the pattern of disease long term remains underinvested, and there's not good business models. Governments, however, I think have a different challenge. They are spending more and more on disability costs, on social costs, on aged care costs, on child and developmental costs in education and in healthcare for relatively low return. So they want a bigger return. So there's a challenge between, I think, the traditional models in healthcare, where the greatest profits are providing really high quality interventions to small numbers, versus how do you provide population level interventions at large numbers, where the business return per person is far lower.
Understood. Thank you. And Hossein, you're working on agentic and AI and human systems relations connecting to one another. Can you tell us, one, just a little bit about how you think what you're working on is going to transform AI, and if that's the first thing you think about because it's on your mind as a CEO, or whether there's something else that pops up?
I don't want to age myself, but I want to tell you a story about 20 years ago. Exactly 20 years ago, I was a master's student in Toronto. I was working with cardiologists to build expert systems for general practitioners in rural parts of Canada to be able to diagnose cardiac diseases. That was, my group came from Jeff Hinton's group. We were building AI capabilities in EMR systems to reduce the risk of misdiagnosis. It took me about a day to train my models. So I let my models run. I showed up in the morning and my models were ready. Just about 4 months ago, I tried those models on an OpenAI platform. It took 28 seconds. So the reason I share this example is that unlike what many people think, the advancement in AI has been very incremental and linear since the 50s. We have had winters and summers. What has changed in the past 3 years is the ecosystem around AI, not necessarily the AI algorithmics itself. In 80s, we had expert systems, then we got neural nets, then we got transformers, and all and all and all. So what I'm very interested about is the augmentation, not replacement, augmentation of the caregiver by agentifying their knowledge, not just based on one electronic medical records, but really understanding the whole ontologies and semantics across the healthcare data. I have not been inspired to be a medical doctor, but I love working with them. So currently, I am working with the Mammoth Orthopedic Institute through a company called Brava Health, with a doctor called Dr. Michael Karsh, who is a well-known orthopedic surgeon. And what we have decided to do is to use 35 years of history to create his agentic version. And it's not just a chatbot, it's his very photorealistic avatar. And it's not just a fun avatar to make. There was a pain point that he shared with us that he has 15 minutes to see a patient. The patient encounter, the first one is 15 minutes. 5 minutes, he has to listen. 5 minutes, he has to do some sort of a diagnosis, and 5 minutes to put things back in the EMR. That first encounter in his practice takes between 3 to 5 weeks. And in 90% of the cases, he needs to order the same set of objective analysis, like MRIs and scans and all that. And then another 3 to 4 weeks for the second patient encounter, in which he has enough data to make some sort of a diagnosis. What we are practicing now is that we are showing that the first patient encounter can be with the agent. And we are tuning these models not based on his EMR, but also based on a company that is researching human-patient behaviors and doctor-patient relationships, reducing anxiety, and bringing an alliance of data systems to make these agentic systems also empathic.
If you don't mind if I interject right here real quick, because you said something that's really interesting, and I want to come back to where you are, but maybe in the next round. And the reason is because you talked about the AI making those decisions based on patient history. You talked about it doing you talked about AI doing administrative tasks and taking care of information that's data. And you also work with biostatistics data and data management with Regeneron. And so there's this sense of like managing data, and often it's talked about even in the media as if, oh, well, if we can just put the data in, then it'll all work. I happen to have had the experience of working with some AI companies who went to hospital centers who said, we would like to do a digital twin, we would like to do all this, and the minute we asked for data, they were said, well, some of it's actually on paper in folders in the basement, some of it's on some system, some of it doesn't actually live in this hospital, et cetera, and it goes completely. So bear with me if I say, wait a minute, let's see how all of this might work out. So I want to come back around here, and I want to come back to Aldo real quick and say, when we're talking about this, and whether it's data that's being managed because it's administrative tasks, or whether it's data that's going into research, we'll get there, and then we'll get to the policy bit. But let's talk a little bit about that. What are we talking about when we talk about data and transforming, AI transforming healthcare, when we have this smorgasbord of data that lives in tons of different places?
I think it depends to a certain extent where you're operating and what data readiness levels you can expect. So in the UK, we're extremely lucky. We have a national healthcare system that provides cradle-to-grave care. And simply through government monitoring requirements, we have for all of London, 10 million patients, for all of the country of Wales, 4 million patients, every single interaction of a patient with the healthcare system, be it a hospital, be it a GP, be it a pharmacy. And so this cradle-to-grave data is organized in secure data environments that people can access. And there's a lot more than just text. It's just actually a fraction is textual data. And that's where the really interesting stuff starts. And that's where we've started to build the Nightingale AI large health foundation model, which is one of the first models that really at scale doesn't reason about language, but reasons about medicine, because it looks at medical data, not text. And the challenge that we're seeing now here is that now we have for the first time a tool that's trained potentially on millions in all of Europe, 500 million people, that's how big the public healthcare systems are in Europe, that can now start to reason about you. Say you have a chest infection, right? If I take this antibiotic, can you show me how my x-ray is going to look like in 2 weeks? That's the type of questions we can start asking of Nightingale. I think the idea is really that we have all this data out there and that we want to bring it together to have a more complete view of you. And that's really the promise that I see from AI methodologies coming, that we can link data we're not thinking about is linkable at the moment for health.
Oh, excellent. And Bari, so in this regard, and excuse me, I've spoken with a number of people, and sometimes these are called, instead of, large language models, they're called large quantitative models, right, where they come in. Is Regeneron working on these types of things, and how do you manage data when you're working with it?
So interestingly, we work with lots of countries actually that have closed healthcare systems, because in the US we don't have that. And so to your point, there's data in many places, and sometimes it's hard to get at and you don't have that complete picture. But what we tend to do is work with healthcare systems either in the US or abroad that actually have that type of information. And we try to create some predictive modeling to help us both design studies, look at some of the outputs of data that we have, do the quantitative modeling that the data is essentially there to utilize. But one of the things I think important, and we work with a number of industry groups and countries that have biobanks, where we created a genetics center to do some of the world's leading sequencing of genetics, and looking at that as a way to use that data to actually help us both target molecules, confirm the targets and the mechanisms of how the drugs that we're thinking about work, but also to take data that isn't readily available and start to add that to the compendium of information that's available in the medical system, and say, what is the genetics telling us that you might link to some of the information that you can get out of healthcare system data? And so that's how we're thinking about it, is how do you link the proteomics, the genomics, all of the medical data that's out there, and really better predict both how patients will appear, but also how you can treat them, what the right studies are, what the right efficacy parameters are, how to measure it, and get more predictive clinical trials in place, so you'll have a better idea of whether the drug targets and whether the drugs will actually work, and on what populations. We in the past have done studies, that have not been on all of the right populations. So now you can actually use some of the genetic data to actually give you a better idea of efficacy in every population.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
Just comment on your data question, because I think the issue also becomes data about outcomes, not just data that's there because there's stuff there that something might magically fall out, and what people care about. For example, in the UK, there's a pushback about disability payments at the moment. And is that related to mental health? Well, let's get rid of the diagnosis, is one suggestion. That's not going to help. But what factors are driving that at the population level? What difference is healthcare making, if any, to those particular issues? They're the sort of things governments are really interested in, of all persuasions. Disability costs, health costs, employment, return to education, those kind of factors. And there tend to be good national data sets about those, but they haven't necessarily been linked in appropriate ways. So one of the issues is within government and within systems, you might have a health system that's cradle to grave, although I think more graves in the UK sometimes than necessary, but a serious kind of issue about access to appropriate levels of healthcare at the right time to get outcomes in particular groups, and who gets outcomes and what happens and those kind of things. We now have a potential to look at those things in really interesting ways. But I think we have to be careful about that the outcomes of greatest interest, particularly from a government and from large investment, are being attended to. Because then governments, I think, are more willing to deal with the policy issues, the privacy issues, the regulatory issues, to allow innovation rather than just being scared and protective of the data sets themselves.
Yeah, this isn't. I don't think it's basically isolated to the UK or to Australia or to the US. This is a general issue straight across the board. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when people talk about the regulatory environments and the restrictive versus open or the confidentiality and what will become public trust, and of course the politics of this in large will be driven by public trust or not. Is it really helping to solve problems that have been really difficult in ways, and ones that are not just, healthcare and health of the population isn't just limited to what the healthcare system does, but where you live, the place, the contributors to that, and what is happening, not just the pattern of healthcare interactions. So I think we have to look beyond the existing data systems we have to what ones really matter, where AI may make a really big difference because of its capacity to deal with big data sets in complex ways and provide new insights.
And with what Aldo was talking about, with 500 million people, you can actually learn quite a lot. And it says if it can learn about me, it brings me back to you, Hossein, which is you're looking at 30 years of medical data. How curated was that for those specific individuals, et cetera? How scalable is something like that? And then what issues do you see? Because we all know that treating the simulacrum of a person is not the same thing as treating the person. And how do we keep that? Well, that gets into a different conversation, but there is a difference between the imagined and the real, right, when it comes to those particular types of things. So with what you're working on, what do you see in terms of what that data produces? And then what do you see in terms of how, what's the fidelity of that to what you're seeing and observing in the real world?
A few years ago, historically, this was a challenge because you had to centralize the data, you had to clean the data, normalize the data, and make sure that you had the semantics in which you can understand the data. One of the most powerful things on AI these days is that I can have heterogeneous set of systems with different data contracts and models, and AI can understand the causalities and correlations. So from building decentralized systems that can interconnect multiple health records or systems of records together, things have become much, much easier. Not just for using historical data, but also we are using it for agent-based simulation, which can generate data based on some of the early examples that were shared. So the challenge we are facing right now in our lab is that, I'm sure many of you heard about agentic AI. Agentic AI software architecture and agentic architecture is not ready to scale. That's why a lot of the use cases and workflows that you see are linear. But if you think about ecosystems in which you have thousands of agents and thousands of people with different legal contracts want to access a near real-time systems, the current software architecture paradigms that we have will come into a halt. So you mentioned chronicles, so that's a core component of our research, which we are building these AI graphs that every single entity, whether a patient or a doctor or an entity, can maintain their data in their graph, and they can only share a token to retrieve the information that you need. There are papers about it that I can share, but our core focus in our team is to build these human AI agentic systems that the human data is fully protected and privacy preserved, and only the small amount that is needed for the particular prompt is being released, intervention can happen, and the data will go back into its secure repository. So if you think about privacy guidelines like GDPR and all the healthcare metrics that you have when it comes to privacy, we think such systems are required to make agentic AI truly scalable for regulated industries such as healthcare and finance.
Okay, excellent. And so I would like to ask you, and I'm going to let whoever wants to jump in first on this jump in, and that is to say, if all of this data is going to be utilized in this way where we can start to learn about each other, right? We can have it be privacy protected. Which part of the healthcare system is going to be affected first? Is it going to be the diagnostics? Is it going to be surgery? Is it going to be, care delivery? Like where is it in this set of value chains that's really going to be to use an American football term, the wedge breaker, right? That goes in.
I think it depends whether it's regulated or not regulated. If it's classed as a medical device, you have a slightly different process, more intensive, more safe. But if you look at problems like triage, problems like optimization, procedural things, workflow optimization aspects, then you will see much further improvements there than in other domains. And then I think the next wave is going to be diagnostic recommendations. And I hope, and I'm here with you, Hossein, that we really want to see systems that can start to treat patients semi-autonomously under the guidance of a clinician, just like we have in many countries, nurse practitioners that can treat patients without taking the valuable time of a clinician. And so I think this is the progression that we're going to see. But all of this is hampered by a key regulatory limitation. It is not the fact that we have regulation, we need regulation. But it's the fact that when we're talking about AI, we're talking about learning systems. But when you make an AI, and I have two spin-outs that are making medical device software AI, the big challenge that you have is once it's trained, you need to freeze its brain and tell you you're not allowed to learn for the rest of your life because a medical device cannot modify itself, should not. For a pacemaker, it makes sense. You don't want the samba on your heart. But for an AI, that's exactly what you not want. And that's something where we need to think differently about how we regulate AI medical devices versus my hip joint or knee joint, to allow the thing to learn on the job, because the countryside hospital is different from an urban hospital, a GP practice is different from a neurological practice, and systems need to be allowed to adapt. We allow doctors to learn on the job, we should allow AIs to learn on the job.
Quick echo on that, and also audit that decision, because that gives you an idea on the emergence of these new systems.
But given that you're talking about what it can and can't do and what it should and shouldn't be allowed to do, if we were to say move to thinking about R&D and the implementation of particular operations, like what are your red lines? Like where do you say this is where it should or shouldn't be used, or where we do or we could but we won't?
I think it's similar to healthcare and treating patients. Physicians and even someone in an R&D space would be using it as an adjunct, right? Can I use AI to provide me interesting data, potentially diagnostic information, and then how do I as a human translate that into the contextual experience that I have, and what does that mean for the patient? The same in R&D. When we're looking at it, we today, because we're so highly regulated, we'll use the information to help us better design, to be more predictive, but we're not at a point where it's validated enough to make decisions on. I think we will get there, but I would say we're not there today. Today it's more as an adjunct, and it's also for speed, right? Cycle time of treating patients, how many do you need to see, the points that were made, right? You will gain more ability to utilize physician, nurse time better, right? That's where you'll start to see it first, because they won't be spending time taking notes. They won't be spending time looking at journals. There'll be summarized information. I think that's the first step. The next is, can you use AI or agentic AI to actually do the work for you and give you the scientific information, make the diagnosis, tell you what target is the right one? We're not there yet, and I think it'll take a bit of time to get there. I think we don't yet trust it, and there's the validation aspect. We need to test it over and over again to make sure that it's not hallucinating, it's giving us the right information. I think companies are moving in that direction, but today it's more, how do we speed up the whole process of what we do?
Okay.
Yeah, there are two sorts of things I think going on. One is within the healthcare system, the efficiency, the improvement, better use of clinician time. There's a much more anarchic thing going on outside the healthcare system. And this is where the regulation's really problematic about health, technology and software as a medical device assumes a kind of within a system as a thing. And mental health's a great example. There's a huge number of people using existing systems by themselves outside of traditional healthcare, seeking information, getting inputs. It's presented as health and well-being. It's presented as not advice, not clinical care. In fact, please don't call it healthcare because then we'll be subject to regulation. Yeah. So it's going to sit out there and it's rapidly kind of developing. People love it. People use it. People who are not receiving healthcare to the systems. So we're going to see this more. We're already seeing it hugely in the mental health area, in child development, linked to education and developmental kind of considerations, in aged care and other areas. People want to do their own healthcare. So there's an empowering aspect, not dependent on the system, not queuing up, not having to pay at their convenience, and it learns about them. So the learning issue that you raise is a really tricky one. There's learning about populations also. There's people, what we really want to do is learn about how different populations are operating, what outcomes they're achieving, not just the general average. We don't want the average. We want to know what specific groups are happening. And what people want is systems that only attend to them, that are highly personalised and learn about them over time. Put the information together they're getting from wearables, from tests, from technology. So the learning question, I think, is actually the hardest one. It's so outside of the traditional way that a device is developed.
Yeah, I see that you want to respond to this. I can see because you read my mind. My question coming to you was going to be, we've been talking about AI, but you're talking about the patient experience, which is a different thing than the AI itself. And then I could see the glint in your eye.
I'm looking out of the audience here, and I see a bunch of highly connected, highly established individuals. So probably if you have a healthcare problem, you know in your network, a well-established medical doctor who can give you the best advice, will make sure that you do the right follow-up, inquire how you're doing, and connect you up to go further. What our hope is with Nightingale AI is that we can literally create an AI Sherpa that democratizes access to the best recommendations because it's trained on the healthcare system. It has learned the care pathways and can help you steer in the right direction. A colleague of mine just told me he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. They told him, don't worry about operating, wait a few months. And then they found, it spread to the lymph nodes and they didn't. And say, oh, we didn't know that you had that type of cancer. Well, because he didn't get the right advice. And what we want is comprehensive healthcare models who can reason about you, that you feed privately with your data, and then can take you by the hand like you had a great friend as a medical doctor.
Well, then let's get to this point, because as you know from Frontiers, part of the mission, right, is to provide solutions and to drive innovation through open science. And when you hear the word open science, people often hear, open data, right? Or, open, there's a lot of things. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because Bari, you come from a place where you recognize that there are things that should be open, and in industry there are also things that people have opinions about that should be closed. So let's talk a little bit about that. If we're going to have AI that's going to know us, that's going to make these things, we're going to have to give permissions, we're going to have to put permissions on the AI. Just exactly where do we stand on what should be open?
Yeah, look, there's an element of proprietary information. If you're creating a molecule and it's something that you think is proprietary, or you have some background knowledge that you're not willing to share, I mean, there's a competitive nature to be innovative, right? And to be in any business for that matter, let alone pharmaceuticals. But I do think, we're in the interest of sharing data and sharing information. Our genetics information is shared with lots of other biotech companies, other pharma companies. We're trying to make sure we can actually exchange information. We're part of a group called Truveta that's trying to take healthcare information for millions of individuals so that we can all learn from data. The ability to learn and to create new models and look at new molecules is something that should be ubiquitous. So I do think the information and healthcare information, to the point that you can preserve privacy, should be open, and we believe that as a company. I think it's the work behind the scenes to think about how we can be an innovative company. What are the next things that we think will be innovative modalities, whether it's genetics or cell medicine, things like that, where you might be able to be a little more innovative, or the rapidity at which we sequence. That's an innovative technology that we have that we wouldn't share. But the outputs of that I think, is shareable. And so that's it's not an easy line to draw, though.
Okay. Dean, do you have any thoughts
Well, I
on
think
this?
it's one of the really big challenges, as you've said. I mean, you want people to invest, and that investment's going to need to come from the private sector, and internationally, you want big investment in a lot of these areas, and we can share across different populations in different places, learning. So that issue becomes, well, okay, well, what's the return on that? What's going to be held? I think on the other side of the coin, people everywhere want to be involved, and lots of people want to contribute to increasing learning in areas they care about. So how to work out the individual kind of concern versus the commercial concern is one of those challenges. I do think it's a soluble one, and the issue exists then in the appropriate protections. But what I see happening from a technical side is that's being increasingly attended to in ways that Hossein was describing. So if people feel that their personal data is being protected, then often they want to contribute to that, whether they're fussed about whether somebody else makes money out of it or not. I mean, basically, in different countries, people have different attitudes to that. I mean, I think what people want is better healthcare. They want to live longer and better. And how does that happen? I mean, they don't think that molecules come from nowhere. They don't think that, diagnostic imaging comes from nowhere. They recognise that that's happening. The way in which governments collectively purchase that, the way they interact with industry, and obviously in this area, the potential investment costs are very large if you want to get substantial gains.
Okay, and given that we can think in certain parts of the world where people have lots of devices, their networks, they're already working in a space where AI is becoming a part of their daily lives. What about in other parts of the world where AI is a part of systems that may be purchased from countries outside of them, right? And we think about the data of populations as a national resource and things like this. Like what does it take to shift the mindset of the political space there towards making this data available to be able to do this kind of work with?
I come in that I'm myself a proponent of open data, open models, because we want to see and get the best that we can out there with the minds that are out there. And I would have said that till about exactly a year ago. And I think what we've seen now is that there's been a reassessment, a realization that patents don't matter so much anymore. Data matters because the AI economy runs off data, and that data sources are national or international assets that carry value. And frankly, I've been to a bunch of panels over the past few days. I'm not sure how far further we're going to go with open data from a top-down political perspective. I think there's going to be retrenchment. Partners are going to talk to partners, friends to friends, but old friends maybe not so much anymore. And so I think there are changes that we're going to see that are happening that are threatening this idea that we could build a much better health AI if we had all the planet's medical, biological, chemical data. And we need to think about how we manage that barrier. This is where suddenly geopolitics comes into play. And one of the most exciting things that has happened in this space, independent of geopolitics, is that Europe, the EU, passed a law that's active since this year. It's called the European Health Data Space, which by 2029 mandates that any health-related data collected in Europe must be made available on request for research and innovation. That's why I'm talking about 500 million patients worth of data. Whether it's your medical record or your Fitbit, you can query that data at cost. Whether that will remain an open resource or will be an entrenched resource for national or local partners is an open question. But we have this great potential, but we need to work together.
So I want to come to you on that. And given where you are, you're working from an entrepreneurial perspective. You're also working in an academic, so you understand what's going on. Do you see anything at the micro scale rather than the macro scale that you think is actually going to change people's minds? Right.
A few quick things, especially on what Piers mentioned. I think Aldo referred to data as asset. We should treat data and medical data as an asset class, trust as the currency, and the AI is the economy around that. That is a framework and a language that you can apply to any jurisdiction and regulation, and they can derive their own way of using that. And then if you treat data as an asset, then you build the right regulations and structures around that. Because our relationship with data has changed. When we say accessing data, is it accessing the data? Is it moving the data? Is it asking questions from the data, use the answer and remove it? If we teach the physics of this new data, a shift from personalization of the old days to participation of the modern days, in which human in the loop is collaborating with the AI, but the decision making is with the human, using data as an asset in which some of it may belong to a company, some of it may belong to a patient, some of it may belong to the doctor. AI can understand how to handle the legalities of that data and optimizes for all the stakeholders. The last thing I say on that, the reason I'm very passionate about healthcare is that, as an example, we ran an AI hackathon at Davos yesterday. We had multiple sectors: finance, healthcare, education, and robotics. It was very clear healthcare is the only sector at the moment that if you adopt AI in it, all stakeholders will win. The patient will win, the caregiver will win, the healthcare system will win. You cannot say that about finance, because someone will need to put that capital first before others can win. And because of that ecological view on healthcare, our view in the past, which is let's silo things, not just healthcare, let's silo all the sectors: finance, healthcare, retail. Let's bring them all together, because that AI will be a fabric that interconnects all aspects of healthcare, and we will see a new model that we never had before.
So then you brought up competition there, right, to a certain extent. And Ian, I want to come to you, because when you're talking about 500 million, you're in the US, in Boston, right? You have the company, you have this mass amount of data. And then I look at Australia with 24 million people, and I think, okay, wait a minute, what does data size, population size, what you can work with mean in terms of the competition, and how does that transform the competition for modern healthcare globally at a scale of that size? So,
well, if you just think it's a national asset, is just the size of the data set, then you think, oh, Australia's very small, doesn't matter. Europe, clearly. If you're thinking about the quality of the data, and to pick up Hossein's earlier point, the thing we're working with, how does specialist knowledge get in? How do you incorporate other kinds of knowledge, which is not just in the records, but how decision making happens? Because really, I think the goal of interaction is in the personalized data set, not just a Sherpa, not a friend, but a really skilled person you care and trust about. It's more than a friend. It's someone who can do what a really skilled person can do with your data alone to influence the healthcare journey that you could make, not the one that the system just typically does with you. What would be the alternatives? In fact, the less common options that would particularly apply to you. So I think what we've been working with is 25 million people is actually a lot of people to look at in those particular areas, and take particular areas, specific areas that are very poorly attended to. My earlier comment about Graves, for example, people with mental health problems die 15 years earlier than everybody else, despite what the healthcare system does. Okay? There's a really inequity issue tied up in that. What's going on? How would you improve that? How would you change their experiences of preventative health and experience in the healthcare system to get a better outcome? You don't need 500 million people to do that. You need to actually look in greater detail what's missing in the interactions, what would change those processes, and demonstrate the efficacy of that. Demonstrate you can actually change the outcome. Then I think you're in a different situation for innovation. So like a lot of innovation, sometimes it happens in smaller areas first and becomes then scalable. Hopefully through all of this, it doesn't take then 10 or 15 years to be scalable. What gets learned gets tested quickly to see if it's more effective, to deliver substantially better outcomes. I think that's the other issue here, isn't just different, but substantially better outcomes for many more people in a more equitable fashion.
Okay. Do I detect the thought?
Yeah, no, I loved the comment. I think probably the most important comment that was made was about data quality, right? We're talking about how much data, whether it's open. The reality is it's the quality of the data. When we look at data and we try to pull data from health records, it's often very incomplete. Where they're not all the health records are capturing different components of data. It's hard to match. Yes, there are systems that now can work through that, but if it's incomplete, it doesn't give you the picture that you're looking for. And you mentioned Fitbit, right? Where now, how do we incorporate, people are wearing rings, and watches and all of this equipment to actually measure things that will really help us figure out, the utility of some of these wearables in being able to treat disease, being able to understand it a little better. But yet we don't really have access to a lot of that data. And there's so much data. The longitudinal data takes so much space, right? That how do you actually measure that and then be able to actually quantify the output? So I think the quality of data, ability to capture the essence of all the possible data that's out there, that I think is something that will allow for the substantial improvement that you're looking for.
I'm going to come to you on this. I want you to mention this, but this is what's popping through my mind right now is thinking about this, is that there is the data where you have the quality of data because you're looking for a specific outcome through the data you're working on. And then there's the kind of data, as you're talking about, where you have this synthetic, like, pipelines of data that come from contextual spaces where it's able to infer things, right, about you as a person or about you that don't come from the data itself just directly in the sense of like, well, how do I actually perform this linear algebra function on the amount of data that is present, but how do I create these inferences and et cetera? So maybe we can talk about that and you can...
Sure. So I have the privilege of being director of the largest AI for healthcare research and training center in Europe. And so we have a number of projects that fit. Hossein, I like this idea about connecting retail and health. So we're running a project that we also started publishing on. We work with Tesco. It's a major supermarket chain in the UK, and women who suffer from ovarian cancer. And we asked a simple question: is there a signal in the shopping behavior data that tells us whether you have an onset of ovarian cancer? And you can look it up. There's also a nice story behind that. But we can now detect a signal 8 months prior to diagnosis that is already indicative. It has to do with it gives you bloating, so you drop the baked beans, you take anti-bloating medicine and other stuff. But this just shows the data is out there everywhere. And we are bleeding the data constantly, just checking your phone, shopping. We need to harness that data. And on the other side is, yes, of course, if you want to build a good AI system, but you're not too good at AI, then you need perfect data, right? That's how we did science for 100 years with linear regression, and then we did perfect data for that. But actually, if you think about how a medical doctor reasons, if you have a doctor and they look at somebody in intensive care and the ECG lead drops off, they will not presume the patient died for 5 minutes. No, they will say, oh, the lead must have slipped off. And so we need to think, and we're developing non-fragile AI systems that have a more human way of reasoning, right? It's still a Gen AI system, it's still a foundation model, but you need to be able to deal with the vagaries of life. And, the vagaries of life, you only learn if you operate in real life settings and not in artificially reductionist settings. Pharma trials are a classic example. You want to develop a drug for dementia, you try to avoid people who have diabetes, who have gout, who have depression. You just want demented people, but that's not how the real world looks like. Doctors can deal with that, and AI should be able to deal with that in the same way.
Absolutely. Hossein, I'm going to start with you because we are at the end of our time, but I would like to know from each of you, from your perspectives, what is the most important thing? Don't fudge around, don't be vague. Like from your perspective, what is the most important thing we have to get right to make AI for modern healthcare successful?
Education, education, education. We need to train the next generation talent on what AI is and is not. We need to have leaders that they can answer this very basic question, AI for what, to do what. And if we bring that level of education to people, AI is a fascinating technology that can bring a lot of value. But if they misuse that technology, not because they have the intent, but because they don't have the literacy, they can really damage a lot of things. So I would say empower the next generation of leaders, whether you're a doctor or a designer or a nurse, understand what AI is and how you can use it.
Excellent. Ian?
I think the engagement of people who we all want to use healthcare. So the public engagement in the process as it develops. It's imperfect at the moment. As it improves, which areas does it clearly improve better? Which areas, if you contribute, if you're engaged, do you get better healthcare? You're more able to run your own journey in those areas, and it holds information about you. Then I think you'll have greater public confidence in it, and you'll sort out pretty quickly those areas where it is really helpful from those in which it's not making a substantive difference.
Thank you.
I'd say a combination of the two is really the adoption. So not just the engagement and the education, but how do you get people to actually use it proficiently with training and education and empowerment, but really that adoption, especially in the industry or in healthcare, right? If physicians aren't using it, if our pharma companies are not using it, if the individuals themselves are not using the power of information to find the right health practitioners or potential new clinical trials, that would leave us with the inability to actually use this to its ability.
Aldo, final
I
word.
think I'm going to repeat your point in slightly different words. I think it's all about change management. And we need to get better at that. We need to bring the team on board. I know radiologists ask him, why are you not deploying more AI, diagnostics and things? Well, change the workflow. We need to bring all technicians, all the nurses on board. It's like, and I feel resistance there. Well, have you thought about how to bring this change about? Because healthcare is more than just medical doctors or just a single AI system. It's an ecosystem, and we need to learn as technologists, as medics, as clinicians, how to bring about that change management.
Well, there you have it. Change management, education, making sure that we move forward in the future, being more knowledgeable about what we're doing, but also a little bit intrepid as we go. So thanks to our wonderful panel for all of their perspectives.